Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the next Construction Buzz webinar. I'm Bogárka from the Construction Buzz team. We are delighted to have the Trade Remedies Authority for today's session with us, where we'll be looking at how the TRA assesses if your business may be suffering injury as a result of unfair imports and the steps they can take to combat unfair trade practices. But before we kick off today's session, I would like to kindly remind you that you will be able to participate by asking questions from our panel using the messaging function on the right side of your screen. And we've also prepared some polls for you, so please keep an eye out for that. And please be aware that a recording of today's session will be made available to you after the session is completed. And now on to our speaker. Today's discussion will be led by Joshua Parker, who is a senior economist at the Trade Remedies Authority. He has 10 years experience as a government economist and has worked at the TRA for the past 5 years. In this role, he oversees the economic assessments of trade remedies, which look at the impact on the whole UK economy. He works with businesses throughout the supply chain to ensure that perspectives are taken into account. Thank you for joining us this morning, Joshua. I am now handing it over to you to kick off today's presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Molly, and thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Bogan said, so I'm an economist working at the Trade Remedies Authority. So I'm here today to really talk to you about what are trade remedies, how it might affect your businesses, how it's worth knowing about, and hopefully you'll come away from it with a bit more of a sense of what they are. So we're going to start with a poll, actually. So straight into that, I think, Bogey, just to kind of give us a sense of what people's kind of level of knowledge is of this topic, because that will help me, I guess, as we go through. So the poll is really just quite simple. It's just literally, do you know what trade remedies are or not? So it's quite be interesting to kind of get a sense of the sort of level of knowledge of trade remedies in the audience today.
Thank you. So I will now close the poll for you and share the results. So 40% of the participants do know, 60% voted as they do not know what trade remedies are.
Excellent. Okay, that's good to know. So we're reaching kind of new people here, but also hopefully for the people who have already do have some knowledge of this, we can kind of give you a bit more of a sense of how you could be sort of directly affected by this, how you could kind of improve your kind of interactions with trade remedies and kind of get the best outcomes for you. So I'll start by answering the sort of first question, what are trade remedies? So trade remedies are a form of government measure that's applied to protect businesses from unforeseen surges of imports or for unfair trade practices. Usually you're thinking of things like tariffs or quotas, so it'll be some sort of restriction on trade into the country, and it's the idea is there to sort of protect businesses against particular sort of imports that they're concerned about. This is something that the other countries do as well. It's allowed under WTO law. So the World Trade Organization is very much sort of set up to encourage free trade and more liberalization and reduce tariffs and that sort of thing. Trade remedies are the one exception to that. So it's almost like an emergency sort of safety valve to protect against anything that we're sort of particularly concerned about. So there's 3 types of trade remedies, which I'll go into in the next few slides. Anti-dumping measures, countervailing measures, and safeguards. The first 2 are the most prominent, but you do also occasionally get the sort of safeguard measure as well. So going into these, so the first and most common type of trade remedies are anti-dumping measures. So these are things that we can apply when imports are being dumped into the domestic market, in our case, the UK. So what that basically means is we look at, so we'd get an allegation of this from a UK producer. They say, we think we're being kind of unfairly competed against by imports that are being sold below their kind of domestic price. And we'd investigate this and we'd look at the price that the foreign producers are selling into the UK at, the price they sell at in the domestic market. We'd make a series of adjustments to make those prices comparable, take them back to kind of an ex-works factory level. And then we'd say, is one higher or lower than the other? So in this case, you've got kind of the foreign industry selling in the UK at a price of $80 and selling in their own market at a price of $100. when you do all the adjustments to make them comparable. And so in this case, they're selling in the UK lower than they're selling in their own country. And so this would be dumping. And so we'd be able to do an anti-dumping measure on imports like this. So in response to that, we could potentially put in place a tariff on these goods that are imported in order to make them kind of on a more level playing field with the kind of UK domestically produced goods. So anti-dumping measures are usually in place for 5 years. They're usually ad valorem tariffs, so like a percentage of the value of the measure. And they're applied against particular importers from particular countries. So it's not a sort of against all countries, it would be against, we use the example of country land. So if there were imports coming from this country, we would only apply it against those imports and not from other countries. So other countries would still be able to import as they would normally. The second type of measure, countervailing measures. So these are put in place against subsidised imports. So it's pretty similar principles to the dumping case, but in this case it's because the imports are able to kind of compete unfairly, as is sort of specified in WTO law, because they're receiving a subsidy from a foreign government. Not all subsidies are eligible for this. One of the key requirements is that they need to be specific subsidies. So they need to be subsidies that specifically affect that particular industry, and they're not just a sort of economy-wide subsidy. But if there's evidence of that subsidy, we can calculate how much that subsidy kind of helps to kind of lower the price of those goods, and then we can apply a subsidy margin to rebalance that. And so yeah, this is how that works. Again, it's usually a 5 year put in place for 5 years and then reviewed. It's usually an ad valorem tariff, and it would be against individual countries or importers from those countries. The third type of measure, safeguards, is a little bit different to the other two because it's a lot more heavy-handed, a lot more sort of wide-ranging. It's also very rare in the trade remedies world. At the moment, we only have one of these measures, whereas we have sort of tens of the other types of measures. Yeah, safeguards are not in response to what is seen as unfair trade. It's where it's unforeseen surges of trade. So if we see sort of a big uptick in trade, or we're worried about that in a particular sort of product category, then a safeguard can be put in place to kind of temporarily prevent that from kind of taking over and flooding the market and completely sort of wiping out the domestic industry. This is by its nature a temporary measure. The dumping and countervailing measures can continue to be renewed and go on for years and years and years. Safeguards can go in for a maximum of 8 years, but actually it's usually in place for sort of 4 years and then a review and then another 4 years. And businesses have to have a kind of plan to show how they're adjusting to the kind of new reality of imports. So it's quite different to the other ones, but it does apply globally, so it applies against all countries. Usually safeguards takes the form of a tariff rate quota. So the case that we have is steel products. So steel products coming into the UK, the majority of them are subject to quotas. That's as a result of our steel safeguard measure. And the kind of original reason for that coming into place was because of the Trump administration putting in place steel tariffs, and then a concern that those tariffs would lead to a massive surge in imports in other countries because people were rediverting their trade from the United States. So in response to that, the EU put in place safeguards, and then as we left the EU, that measure was then transitioned into the UK. Yeah, so this is very rare, very sort of heavy-handed, but it could be very effective at sort of making sure the industry is not completely decimated by huge sort of increases in imports. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of what are trade remedies. Now I kind of want to talk about how they actually relate to businesses on the ground, how they might be important or not. So I'm going to start by talking about steel. Steel is one of the most common users of trade remedies around the world, not just in the UK. The main reason for that is because there's sort of systematic oversupply of steel in the world economy. So it's very common to see some of the sort of dumping behaviours in the steel world. So in the UK, the steel industry, it is worth $2 billion a year to the economy, and it supports about 30,000 jobs, and with a particular concentration in certain areas. So it's concentrated in South Wales and North Lincolnshire, So it's quite an important industry to the UK economy. But because it faces a lot of these kind of pressures from international trade from other countries, they've kind of petitioned for us, and we've put in place a number of measures, trade remedies measures. So there's actually 20 trade remedy measures on different forms of steel products. And then there's also a steel safeguard measure. So a lot of steel products from countries like China face higher tariffs. So if you're importing rebar from China, for instance, it's more expensive as a result of the trade remedy measures in place. And then there's also quotas on a lot of steel products as well, and that's also as a result of trade remedy measures. So yeah, so this is obviously very good for the steel industry. It helps to protect them. It's an important industry. It's protecting a lot of those jobs and making sure that this industry isn't completely wiped out by the sort of international trade flows into the country. But equally, if we're putting on a trade remedy measure, it does have pros and cons. So there's some people who lose out because of this as well. And we're aware that the construction sector, and I'm assuming that I'm speaking to quite a lot of people from that sector, the construction sector is the biggest user of steel. So our data suggests that construction accounts for sort of £2 billion of sale of steel in 2015. So yeah, the construction sector, if you're buying steel, you're kind of facing higher prices, potentially more difficulty sourcing the steel products because of the trade remedy measures that are in place. So that's something that's quite important for us to kind of weigh up when we're looking at putting in place a measure or reviewing an existing measure. So I was just going to show you an example of how this kind of works with a fictitious case. I wasn't really, to be honest, I'm not an expert in the construction industry, and that's kind of one of the themes coming out. This is actually the amount that you can kind of contribute to these cases by giving your expertise. But I thought maybe an example could be prefab houses. So let's say that you have prefab houses being imported into the UK, and the UK industry felt that these were being sold at unfair prices, they were being dumped potentially. So we could consider putting in place a tariff. When we do that, we need to consider all the different effects. So obviously for the UK producers of whatever this product is, they're very happy about that tariff. It means that their competition has to kind of sell at a higher price. It makes their products more competitive. It hopefully increases their sales, increases their market share. It's also good for their upstream industry, so that the people that they buy raw materials from, because they're getting kind of more orders from that industry. So there's some industries that are benefiting a lot from this tariff. But then on the flip side, if you're buying this product, if you're buying prefab houses, if you're installing it or if you're importing it, you're facing kind of pressures in the other direction. If for importers, your imports are becoming less competitive. For installers, you're paying higher costs, and potentially those things could be passed on to consumers as well. So it's our job to, when we're considering putting in place a measure, thinking about who's going to gain, who's going to lose, what are the sort of size of those impacts? Is it kind of something that we're really worried about? But we often need, or we do need, the help of people in those industries to kind of tell us what does it look like from their point of view. And it is very common on cases that we'll hear a lot from the UK producers, because they're obviously very in favour of tariff being put in place, and we won't often hear that much from some of the people being harmed. So I think whether or not you're kind of in favour or against the tariff, the message from us really is try and contribute to our cases and participate, because it can massively shape what the outcomes of the case can be, and it could mean a sort of higher, lower tariff. It could mean not having a tariff or having a tariff. So that could have quite material impacts for your bottom line. I'm just going to talk briefly about what we do within an investigation, but I'll try and keep this quite light, because it is quite technical. I'm not sure how useful it is for you. But when we're doing an investigation, there are a number of different elements that we need to go through, a number of different things that we need to kind of find evidence for. So we look for evidence of, in a dumping case, it would be there's evidence are imports being dumped. Then we look at the UK producer side. Are the UK producers being injured? And then we look for a causal link between those two. So are the UK producers being injured because of that sort of dumped imports? All of those elements need to be met in order for us to be allowed to put in place a trade remedy. So under World Trade Organization laws, under international law, you aren't allowed to put in place trade remedy unless you can prove those first 3 stages. So if you want a trade remedy in place, you need to help to provide as evidence of these first 3 steps. So is there dumping, or are you suffering injury, and is one causing the other? So that's the first step, basically looking at are we legally allowed to put in place a trade remedy measure? But then the UK conducts another step, which is the economic interest test, and that's basically us looking at it and thinking about, well, actually, is this the right thing to do for the UK economy? We are legally allowed to put a tariff in place, but should we do it? Do the costs outweigh the benefits? So yeah, that's kind of the additional step that we take in the UK. Not all countries do that, so that's kind of relatively, I think, a point of difference for our system. So when we're looking at that economic interest test, these are the sorts of things we're asking ourselves, and we're looking for information from the parties involved. So we're looking at who is going to be affected by the measure, which businesses, both who's winning and who's losing, what consumers, what do they look like, do they have any particular characteristics, and then how important are all of these sort of different elements to the UK economy. So there'd be no point in protecting a very small business if it then really harmed a massive sort of significant industry that added a lot to the UK economy. So we need to kind of take into account the relative size and importance of these different businesses. We also need to take into account the size of the impact that we might expect to have on those. If this product is a really minor input to a downstream business, is potentially not something we'd be as worried about as if it was a more fundamental thing that really kind of impacted their profit margins. So yeah, so we're looking at who's being affected, how would they be affected, kind of what direction are the impacts, and how big are they. We also look at where do those impacts fall. So we look at different areas of the UK to see if particular areas are more affected than others. So for instance, on a lot of our steel cases, steel is a very important regional producer in South Wales, for instance. And so it's important for us to recognise that not only are potentially jobs at risk for certain industries, but they also might be at risk for certain areas, and thinking through the impacts on the local labour market as well. But that may also be true for the downstream industry. We're also looking at whether certain groups, so groups with particular like protected characteristics, for instance, whether they might be more affected. You know, if we have a product that was used by people with disabilities or something, that would be something we take into account there. We also do a competition assessment. We want to make sure that we're looking at the conditions of competition in the market at the moment and how they might be affected. So if we've got kind of a monopoly, we wouldn't want to be protecting that monopoly at the expense of in order to just to put in place our measure. But equally, it might be the case that putting in place a measure helps a few businesses to stay in the market and actually retain and allow competition to thrive in the long run. We also have the ability to consider anything else within the economic interest test, which is a bit more sort of basically, we don't generally have a typical thing we look at here. It depends on the case. So we'll get different sort of issues that are raised on a case-by-case basis. One of the good examples we've had is with a lot of our steel cases, environmental factors come into play. The steel sector will say that we produce in the UK at a sort of in a green way than potentially some of the other countries. And so therefore there's kind of environmental benefits of producing in the UK versus the countries, but that might be different in different industries. So when we're doing an investigation, we gather evidence, we analyse it, and then we make recommendations. So really, if you're involved in a case, whether you're kind of a buyer of a product, whether you're a seller or maker of a product, if you're in some ways linked to it, your first thing will be kind of at that evidence gathering stage, as much as possible, make yourself known, and we'll try and reach out to you as much as possible. You have the ability to submit questionnaires, survey results to us, so we can get your evidence from you. We also do our own kind of additional research and try and find other businesses that haven't potentially engaged in the case, and we do our own kind of desk research as well. But it's fair to say that we're not going to be an expert in every single product that we deal with. So it's really, really helpful. We get a lot from the submissions that we get from different parties. And if we're only hearing from one side of the debate, then we're naturally going to be, our evidence base is going to be weighted in that way. So we gather all the evidence, and that really does involve quite a big collaboration with all of the different businesses involved. And then we analyze it, look at the different sort of elements that I've said before, and then we make a recommendation to the Secretary of State for the Department for Business and Trade to say whether or not, yes, we think there should be a tariff, or no, we don't in this case. And at the recommendation stage, we have that in two parts. So we'll have our kind of initial recommendations, and we'll give parties a chance to comment on that and kind of interrogate our decision and sort of suggest new evidence. And then we'll come up with a final recommendation based on any of the additional submissions of evidence at that point. So just talking through kind of how long these cases can take to make. So let's say you're a business, you're producing something, and you're worried that you're kind of being unfairly competed against by international imports. You could come to us, talk to us, talk to our pre-app office, and make an application with us. We then look at that application, sort of look at the sort of strength of the evidence there, and decide whether or not there's enough evidence to kind of initiate a case. And we do that over a 40-day period. And if the application was rejected, it would be possible for you to come back again with another one, but you'd have to kind of, try and deal with the evidence gaps that we've identified. Once we've then initiated a case, it's generally sort of 12 months to 18 months to kind of complete it. So we would start with the kind of registration period where companies can come and say we're interested in this. It could also be trade unions and trade associations can all kind of register with the case. Anyone who's kind of thinks that they have an interest in the case is able to do that. So they'll sort of register on our public file. Then they can submit questionnaires, submit information to us. We'll assess that. We'll verify it where we can. So that might involve, if you're a business, you're giving us your financial data, we might come and talk to you about that and just check that we're kind of happy and we can understand and see where it's all coming from. And then we'll produce our kind of initial results at the statement of essential facts stage, give everyone a chance to comment on that, our sort of right of reply, and then we'll take any new evidence on board and go to our final recommendation. We also have the ability to put in place provisional measures. So that is obviously sort of 12 to 18 months could be a long time. And if you're kind of facing a lot of competition right now, you want protection as soon as possible. So we have the ability to put in place a provisional measure, probably about sort of 6 months into the case, just to make sure that there's not a sort of like to protect the business while the investigation is going on, just to make sure that they don't, for instance, go out of business during the course of the investigation. Just to give you an example of some of the different products we've investigated, because it's really quite broad. So we've had, you can see here pictures of different products. So we've had tires case, we've had many different steel products, as I've kind of mentioned already. We've had rainbow trout, ironing boards, we've got a case on e-bikes at the moment, optic fiber cables, and there's a lot of products that we've had that I think have kind of links to the construction industry. So I had a sort of list of them. So we have, well, obviously lots of steel products, which I think feed into the construction sector. So rebar, steel ropes and cables. We've also had glass fiber products, optic fiber cables, I think can be used in, if you need to put internet into buildings. Excavators, we've got a case right now on excavators, aluminium extrusions, ceramic tiles. So I think there's potentially quite a lot of links to the construction sector here. So it's very possible that you may already have an interest in our cases. Either they're helping you or they're hindering you, and if so, it's good to kind of let us know your views, because we can't we can't be experts on all of these different products. There's just so many of them. So we're really reliant on the evidence that we receive from different businesses. And if you don't give us your side of the argument, then there's a danger that you're not going to get a ruling that helps you. Yes. So what can you do? So if you've sort of looked at this and think actually there could be a sort of issue here for me, it kind of depends on what your situation is. So if you are producing a product in the UK and you think that you're facing competition from imported goods that either falls into the kind of dumping category, so you think it might be dumped or it might be subsidized and therefore it's kind of undercutting you, or if you think you're going to face a surge of imports, although I think that one's a lot rarer, come and talk to our pre-app office, and I'll have details at the end of this for them, so you can reach out to them. They can kind of advise you on what sort of things you might need to look for, what you might need to kind of provide us to basically making an application for an investigation. Yeah, so I definitely suggest if you're worried about this, if you think that you are facing some sort of competition, come and talk to our pre-app office and see whether or not Trade Remedy might be the right sort of option for you to kind of apply for. On the other hand, if you are buying a good that is subject to a current investigation or is subject to a measure that's already in place, you can register for the case, and I've got a link in there, and I think these slides will be shared afterwards. You can register as an interested party, you can submit evidence, give your sort of side of the story. As I mentioned, there's a lot of products that we deal with that I think have relevance to the construction sector, so it may be the case that you're actually buying them more than you're producing them. It depends on your kind of company, and yeah, in either case, if you don't give us your evidence, we'll try our best to find that, but it's a lot harder for us to find that. So there's a danger that we're going to rule in a sort of adverse way to you if we're not hearing your side of the story. On the flip side, so if you're exporting goods, you could face trade remedies from other countries. So we don't sort of participate in those, but we definitely recommend that you really actively sign up to those cases and provide evidence, because again, if you're not providing your evidence, there's a real danger that they're only going to hear from one side of the story and they'll just rule in the favor of the other groups that are kind of making a case. So it's definitely within your interest to make sure that you're really participating actively in those investigations. The rates that get applied, the tariffs that potentially come out of these measures, they can be very, very high, especially if parties don't participate in them. So it's definitely within your interest to participate in these cases. So that's been a really quick kind of run through of what trade remedies are, how they might affect you, how you can kind of do something about this, and maybe make sure that trade remedies work in the best way for your business and that you're not being harmed when you needn't be if you can provide us with the sort of right evidence. So that was all I was trying to run through today. Just wanted to end with a quick poll, just to see, from those listening to the audience, do you think there's any sort of relevance of trade remedies to your business? Just be interesting to kind of get that. We're, as a sort of authority, we're kind of still quite new. We were created after the UK left the EU, and we're still kind of learning the best ways to kind of contact the kind of businesses that might be interested in our cases. So yeah, it'd be good to know whether or not anyone in the audience thinks that trade remedies might be relevant to your business. We're just waiting for the results to come in.
So we have nearly 70% of our participants voted. So I will post a poll and share the result with you.
Okay, thank you.
So 94% voted with yes, that it is relevant to their business, and only 6% thinks that it is not.
Brilliant. That's good to hear, because that means that we're kind of reaching the right people. So there's a load of information on there that, again, these slides will be shared afterwards. So if you want to kind of reach out to us and get kind of further information. But yeah, just very happy to take any questions at this point. If anyone has any questions based on what they've heard, anything they wanted to kind of just get a bit more information on.
We have a couple of questions. So I will read the first one from Bill. So Bill is asking, how do you ensure that quota allocations are fairly distributed and not just grabbed by one or two companies? Yeah, good question. So quotas are based, so this would normally be for a safeguards case, so where we think there's a surge of imports. So those are based on historic trade flows. So we have to look at
what were the sort of traditional patterns of trade, which countries were traditionally kind of importing the most, and we allocate quotas based on that. So if let's take a wire rod. So if wire rod traditionally sort of 50% of the imports came from China, then we give them a quota that was kind of equivalent size to the 50% of the sort of total size of the quota that we want to do it. So it's based on traditional trade flows. But this is something that we can monitor and change over time. So if you have kind of evidence that this is not really working, and that, for instance, some quotas are just being completely used up and others are not, that's something where you can kind of come and talk to us about that, and we can consider whether or not we can do quota reviews. So we do individual quota reviews and check that things are kind of working as intended. For instance, with quotas, the default is that developing countries are exempt from quotas, but that then is they then come into the scope of the quotas if they import too much, basically, if they rise above a certain threshold, which I don't have to hand. So when we make our original decision, we might say country X is a small developing country. They haven't been importing a lot traditionally, so they'll be exempt from the quota. But if over time, actually, then you see them suddenly shoot up and they're importing a lot more and it's not within the scope of the quota, we can then sort of change it to sort of bring them in scope of it. And that works in both directions as well. If it's going the other way, then we can kind of take countries out if they're not really using up the quota as well. So I guess the point to say is if you're worried about something, come and talk to us about it. It is something where we have the ability to change the quotas over time. It is something we have to kind of monitor and adjust, because quotas are quite a sort of blunt instrument. So yeah.
Thank you, Josh. There is another question. How do you see carbon border adjustment mechanisms impacting on our trade remedies frameworks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Very interesting. I said before that it is a sort of an issue that we kind of commonly encounter, is that people claim that goods are being produced in other countries and they're able to produce them much more cheaply because they're not subject to kind of certain environmental regulations. So the first thing is we can already kind of account for that within the economic interest test, and that is something we have encountered in the past. So we already can kind of, to some extent, take that into account and make sure that that influences our decision, and we can kind of quantify the environmental impacts of our measures. But going forwards, yeah, that would be something that then we would take into account when we do our adjustments. So when we're looking at a dumped product, we adjust prices to sort of take everything away. So the transport costs, the duties that are paid, maybe insurance, we take all of that off and take prices back to an ex works level. So with carbon border adjustments, we would also kind of take that into account as well. So the idea is that we're comparing like with like, and that we are saying, are people actually competing at the same level here? Is this a fair kind of comparison?
Thank you. The next question is from Laura. She's asking, when investigating, do you proactively go out to businesses and industry bodies for input, or do you rely on businesses choosing to register with an ongoing investigation?
Yeah, good question. Yes, so we do go out to businesses, but often we don't get a huge amount of response. So a sort of typical case, we've got a new product coming in, we will go and talk to, or if a business has made a sort of initial application, we'll definitely be talking to them. But then we'll generally try and go through the trade associations, also do our own research to find, are there any kind of known major players in these markets? So yes, we will do as much as we can to proactively kind of make people aware of our cases. But often, like I've been on a lot of cases where we've made people aware of their cases, and well, so what? I don't know what trade remedies are. I don't really see how this affects me. So I think there's a big kind of piece, and this is part of that we're doing today, is trying to raise awareness of how these measures actually affect people, so that we can make sure that people know that actually this sort of concept that isn't that widely well known, trade remedies can have material impacts on their businesses. So I think that's a kind of wider piece of work that we're trying to do as an organisation, is raise more awareness, so that when we do reach out to businesses, hopefully more of them will come back to us and actually give us evidence. Yeah, but we do rely on trade associations as much as we can to try and act as our sort of middle sort of person to sort of give the message to their members, and then sometimes that works better than others. It kind of depends on the stance of the trade association.
Thank you. The next question is from Theo. So basically, Theo is asking if there is a public register of ongoing investigations, and if so, where can this be found?
Yes, it is the public file. There was a link to that in this. I don't know whether we also have a link later on. No, you could find it on our website, but I think the best link would be the one here. So the register of the case thing here. So that would tell you where what the active sort of measures are at the moment. So yes, good question.
We can also share that if anyone needs it later on. And we have one last question. If you could basically just, apologies, just basically talk a bit more about how to know which measures can apply to businesses, basically.
Yeah, very good question. So I think the really simple answer to that is to talk to the pre-app office, and they can help you with that. But I guess it comes down to the kind of nature. And I think, so just to take you back to those things originally, so we've got the three types of measures: anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, or countervailing measures, which is against subsidies, and safeguard. I think generally it's more like a confusion between the first two than the third one. Safeguard looks very different. So this, you would be expecting to see increasing imports across the board. You'd expect it to be just a complete sort of tidal wave of imports, something that's kind of fairly obvious. So I think if you're seeing massive import increases from, or even sort of more than kind of historic levels across the board, that's when safeguards would be right for you. It's a bit more difficult, I think, with the sort of subsidy cases or the dumping cases, because you may be seeing kind of imports coming in there, they're cheaper, and you're not really clear on, are they cheaper because it's dumped, or are they cheaper because it's a subsidy? So the first thing is talk to our pre-app office about that. But the second thing is we can actually do a joint investigation where we initiate both of the cases at the same time, and we do that in many cases. We've currently got a couple of joint investigations where we're looking at is the good being dumped and is it being subsidised, and we're kind of answering both questions at the same time. And it may be the case that we go through that and we find actually there's no subsidies happening here. We can kind of end that one, and that will have a kind of negative outcome. And then, but we do find a lot of evidence of dumping there. So I think the short answer is talk to the pre-app office and get their advice on it. But the other answer is also that we can do two investigations at once on the same product, and kind of use that as a way of figuring out what is actually the problem, because it may be difficult for you as a sort of domestic industry to figure out, well, I'm seeing these goods, they seem a lot cheaper than they should be. I don't know whether that's a subsidy or whether it's dumped. That's something we can kind of figure out over the course of the investigation.
Thank you so much. And if anyone would have any more questions as well, please feel free to reach out. I think, Josh, you had a slide with the contact details, but you can also share it. We don't have any more questions at this time, so I would like to thank you for this insightful presentation and everyone who took the time to join us this morning. We trust that you've gained valuable insights, and judging the polls results, it looks like you did. So this was a useful session. If you will need a refresher, the recording will be sent out shortly and will also be available on the Construction Buzz GoToWebinar platform. Thank you so much again, Josh, and thank you everyone. Have a nice rest of your days.
Thank you.